She sat across from her castmates at that reunion table and weighed in on Dorrit Kemsley's marriage. She had opinions. She had observations. She had the particular confidence of someone who felt entitled to speak on the subject of separation, of distance, of what it looks like when a marriage starts coming apart at the seams in front of an audience. And the whole time, she and Mauricio hadn't filed a single piece of paperwork. Not one. Let that sit for a second. Kyle Richards, who announced a separation from her husband of nearly 30 years back in July 2023, who let that announcement ripple through the Bravo universe and become one of the defining storylines of recent Rob seasons, who has discussed their distance, their living arrangements, their uncertain future in interviews and on camera more times than most people can count, revealed on a podcast that she and Mauricio are not legally separated. Never have been. The word, separation, that everyone absorbed and processed and formed opinions around, it was never backed by anything legal. Nothing was ever filed. The reaction online was a specific kind of tired. Not explosive, not outraged, just tired. The particular exhaustion of a fanbase that has been sitting with an open-ended question for nearly 3 years and just found out the question was never as concrete as they'd been led to believe. There's a phrase Kyle used that's worth looking at closely. She said this arrangement is working for us so far, and then she immediately added the so far caveat herself, almost preemptively, like she knew how that sentence would land. Like she knew that working for us needed a qualifier, needed some acknowledgement that this gray area she's describing doesn't have an obvious exit point. She said, almost verbatim, that they're not going to stay in this gray area forever. But here's what she didn't say: when it ends, or how, or what she actually wants. And that vagueness, that persistent, practiced vagueness, is starting to wear on people who have been genuinely invested in this story. Think about what the audience has been asked to hold over the past few years. They watched Kyle and Mauricio announce a separation that turned out to have no legal foundation. They watched Kyle navigate a very public and very scrutinized close friendship with Morgan Wade that generated its own separate wave of speculation about her personal life. They watched her show up to reunions and press events and podcast appearances and give answers that were carefully constructed to reveal just enough to keep the conversation going without actually resolving anything. And all of this while, it now turns out, the legal status of her marriage remained completely unchanged. That's a lot to ask of an audience. And some viewers are starting to push back in a way that feels less like anger and more like disengagement. There's a difference between those two things, and disengagement is actually harder to come back from. What makes this particular revelation sting a little more is the Dorrit comparison, and I think this is the detail that's generating the most genuine frustration. Because Kyle has not been shy about commenting on Dorrit Kemsley's separation from PK. She's weighed in, offered perspective, been present in those conversations in the way that castmates are when a co-star's marriage becomes a visible storyline. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. That's how the show works. Cast members' lives intersect and they comment on each other's situations. It's the whole format. But there's something that feels off about commenting on someone else's divorce proceedings when your own separation has never actually been filed. When you're living in a gray area that you've never fully disclosed. When the version of your story that exists in the public's mind is technically incomplete. Dorrit's situation has involved the kind of real, grinding, financially stressful reality that separations often do, the practical consequences of legally untangling a life built with another person. Kyle, by her own admission, hasn't been anywhere near that. She's been in a softer, more ambiguous space, separate but not separated, apart but not legally so, somewhere between married and not married in a way that has no clean name. Some viewers have started wondering whether the separation framing was always more of a narrative choice than a legal reality. Whether it served a purpose, for the show, for the storylines, for the particular version of Kyle Richards that Rob needs her to be right now. That's not an accusation. It's a question that the timeline seems to invite. And here's another layer. Kyle has 4 daughters with Mauricio. She has a family structure that is deeply intertwined with his in ways that go far beyond a marriage certificate. The social and familial architecture of their life together is enormous. When you have that much shared history, that many roots growing in the same direction for that many years, the idea of filing for divorce becomes something very different than it might for couples with less tangled lives. It becomes not just a personal decision but a structural one. An architectural demolition. So there's a version of this where Kyle's hesitation to formalize anything makes complete emotional sense. Where the gray area isn't avoidance or performance but genuine, honest uncertainty about dismantling something that has been the center of her adult life. I can hold that interpretation. I think it's real. But I also think there's a version where the ambiguity serves her professionally in ways that she's aware of, even if she doesn't say so directly. Kyle Richards' storyline on Rob, for several seasons now, has been her marriage. Her relationship status. The will not they of whether she and Mauricio find their way back to each other or finally, formally, let go. That is compelling television. That is the kind of sustained emotional uncertainty that keeps people tuning in. And the moment it resolves, the moment there's an answer, clean and final in either direction, that particular chapter closes. The gray area, in other words, is not just where Kyle lives emotionally. It might also be where she lives professionally. A lot of viewers have arrived at the conclusion that a divorce will simply never happen. That Kyle and Mauricio will continue to exist in this strange in-between state, not fully together, not formally apart, for as long as the show runs, possibly longer. That they'll grow older in parallel, their lives still crossing through the daughters they share, through the properties and memories and decades of history, without ever signing anything that makes the distance official. And honestly, some people seem almost at peace with that read, because it takes the dramatic tension off the table and replaces it with something more human. Two people who built a life together and can't quite figure out how to classify what they are to each other now. But other people are genuinely done with it. Not angry. Just done. The sense that the storyline has been stretched past the point where it generates real feeling, that the audience has been in this waiting room for too long and the door hasn't opened, that's a real shift in how people are engaging. Or rather, how some of them are choosing not to anymore. What I find myself thinking about is what comes next for Kyle on the show. Because if the marriage storyline has hit a ceiling, if there's only so many more seasons you can build around, still in the gray area, then something has to shift. Either the resolution comes, in one direction or the other, or Kyle finds a new center of gravity for her presence on the show. New conflict, new alliance, new vulnerability to offer the camera. And Kyle Richards has been on this show since the beginning. She's an OG in the truest sense. She knows better than almost anyone how the machine works, what it needs, when a storyline has run its course. So either she genuinely doesn't know how this ends, which is entirely possible and entirely human, or she's managing it with more intentionality than she lets on. Both things can be true simultaneously. That's what makes her so difficult to read after all these years. The question that keeps surfacing and that no one has been able to answer cleanly is whether Kyle and Mauricio are headed towards something or just treading water. Whether the gray area has a destination or whether it's the destination. Whether, so far, has an end point or whether it just keeps extending, season after season, podcast after podcast, reunion after reunion, until the whole thing quietly becomes the status quo. And maybe that's the most honest answer available right now. Nobody knows. Including, perhaps, Kat. So tell me where you are with all of this. Are you still invested in how the Kyle and Mauricio story ends? Or has the ambiguity finally worn you down to the point where you've stopped waiting for a resolution? Because I feel like the fan base is genuinely split on this one in a way that says something real about where the show is right now. Drop it in the comments. I want to know if you're still in the waiting room or if you've already walked out. Catch Rob Thursdays on Bravo and streaming on Peacock.